Section 38, page 190. I said to her, "Honor's always been honor, and honesty, honesty, in Manson Mingott's house, and will be till I am carried out of it feet first." The old woman had stammered into her daughter's ear, in the thick voice of the partly paralyzed, and when she said, "But my name, auntie, my name is Regina Dallas," I said, "It was Beaufort when he covered you with jewels, and it's got to stay Beaufort now that he's covered you with shame." So much, with tears and gasps of horror, Mrs. Welland imparted, blanched and demolished by the unwonted obligation of having at last fixed her eyes on the unpleasant and the discreditable. "If only I could keep it from your father-in-law," he always says. "Augusta, for pity's sake, don't destroy my last illusions." "And how am I to prevent his knowing these horrors?" the poor lady wailed. "After all, Mamma, he won't have seen them," her daughter suggested, and Mr. Welland sighed. "Ah, no, thank heaven he's safe in bed, and Dr. Bancombe has promised to keep him there till poor Mamma's is better, and Regina has been got away somewhere." Arthur had seated himself near the window and was gazing out blankly at the deserted thoroughfare. It was evident that he had been summoned rather for the moral support of the stricken ladies than because of any specific aid that he could render. Mr. Lovell Mingott had been telegraphed for, and messages were being dispatched by hand to the members of the family living in New York, and meanwhile there was nothing to do but to discuss in hushed tones the consequences of Beaufort's dishonor and of his wife's unjustifiable action. Mrs. Lovell Mingott, who had been in another room writing notes, presently reappeared, and added her voice to the discussion. In their day, the elder ladies agreed, the wife of a man who had done anything disgraceful in business had only one idea, to efface herself, to disappear with him. There was the case of poor Grandmamma Spicer, your great-grandmother, May. Of course, Mrs. Welland hastened to add, your great-grandfather's money difficulties were private, losses at cards, or signing a note for somebody. I never quite knew, because Mamma would never speak of it. But she was brought up in the country because her mother had to leave New York after the disgrace. Whatever it was, they lived up the Hudson alone, winter and summer, till Mamma was 16. It would never have occurred to Grandmamma Spicer to ask the family to countenance her, as I understand Regina calls it, though a private disgrace is nothing compared to the scandal of ruining hundreds of innocent people. Yes, it would be more becoming in Regina to hide her own countenance than to talk about other people's, Mrs. Lovell Mingott agreed. I understand that the emerald necklace she wore at the opera last Friday had been sent out on approval from Ball and Bellax in the afternoon. I wonder if they will ever get it back. Arthur listened unmoved to the relentless chorus. The idea of absolute financial probity as the first love of gentleman's code was too deeply ingrained in him for sentimental considerations to weaken it. An adventurer like Lemuel Stutters might build up the millions of his shoe polish on any number of shady dealings, but unblemished honesty was the noblesse oblige of old financial New York. Nor did Mrs. Beaufort's fate greatly move Arthur. He felt, no doubt, more sorry for her than her indignant relatives, but it seemed to him that the tie between husband and wife, even if breakable in prosperity, should be indissoluble in misfortune. As Mr. Little Blair had said, a wife's place was at her husband's side when he was in trouble, but society's place wasn't at his side, and Mrs. Beaufort's cool assumptions that it was seemed almost to make her his own accomplish. The mere idea of a woman's appealing to her family to screen her husband's business dishonor was inadmissible, since it was the one thing that the family, as an institution, couldn't do. The mulatto maid called Mrs. Lovell Mingott into the hall, and the latter came back in a moment with a frowning brow. "She wants me to telegraph for Ellen Olenska. I had written to Ellen, of course, and to Medora, but now it seems that's not enough. I am to telegraph to her immediately. and to tell her that she is to come alone. The announcement was received in silence. Mrs. Welland sighed resignedly, and May rose from her seat and went to gather up some newspapers that had been scattered on the floor. "I suppose it must be done," Mrs. Lovell Mingott continued, as if hoping to be contradicted, and May turned back toward the middle of the room. "Of course it must be done," she said. "Granny knows what she wants, and we must carry out all her wishes. Shall I write the telegram for you, Auntie? If it goes at once, Ellen can probably catch tomorrow morning's train." She pronounced the syllables of the name with a peculiar clearness, as if she had tapped on two silver bells. "Well, it can't go at once. Jasper and the pantry boy are both out with notes and telegrams." May turned to her husband with a smile. "But here's Newland, ready to do anything. Will you take the telegram, Newland? There will be just time before luncheon." Archer rose with a murmur of readiness, and she seated herself at old Catherine's rosewood, one who de who, and wrote out the message in her large, immature hand. When it was written, she blotted it neatly and handed it to the Archer. "What a pity," she said, "that you and Ellen will cross each other on the way, Newland," she added, turning to her mother and aunt, "is obliged to go to Washington about a patient lawsuit that is coming up before the Supreme Court. I suppose Uncle Lovell will be back by tomorrow night, and with Granny improving so much, it doesn't seem right to ask Newland to give up an important engagement for the firm, does it?" She paused, as if for an answer, and Mrs. Welland hastily declared, "Oh, of course not, darling. Your Granny would be the last person to wish it." As Archer left the room with the telegram, he heard his mother-in-law add, presumably to Mrs. Lovell Mingott, "But why on earth she could make you telegraph for Ellen Olenska?" And May's clear voice rejoined, "Perhaps it's to urge on her again that, after all, her duty is with her husband." The outer door closed on Archer, and he walked hastily away toward the telegraph office. Chapter 28. "All oi, however spell it, anyhow?" asked the tart young lady, to whom Archer had pushed his wife's telegram across the brass ledge of the Western Union office. "Olenska, oh, Olenska," he repeated, drawing back the message in order to print out the foreign syllables above May's rambling script. "It's an unlikely name for a New York telegraph office, at least in this quarter," an unexpected voice observed, and turning around Archer, saw Lawrence Lefford at his elbow, pulling an imperturbable moustache and affecting not to glance at the message. "Hello, Newland. Thought I would catch you here. I just heard of old Mrs. Mingott's stroke, and as I was on my way to the house, I saw you turning down the street, and nipped after you. I suppose you have come from there." Archer nodded and pushed his telegram under the lattice. "Very bad, eh?" Lefferts continued. "Worrying to the family, I suppose. I gather it is bad, if you are including Countess Olenska." Archer's lips stiffened. He felt a savage impulse to dash his fist into the long, vain, handsome face at his side. "Why?" he questioned. Lefferts, who was known to shrink from discussion, raised his eyebrows with an ironic grimace that warned the other of the watching damsel behind the lattice. Nothing could be worse, from the look reminded Archer, than a display of temper in a public place. Archer had never been indifferent to the requirements of form, but his impulse to do Lawrence Lefferts a physical injury was only momentary. The idea of bandying Ellen Olenska's name with him at such a time, and on whatsoever provocation, was unthinkable. He paid for his telegram, and the two young men went out together into the street. There Archer, having regained his self-control, went on, "Mrs. Mingott is much better. The doctor feels no anxiety whatever." And Lefferts, with profuse expression of relief, asked him if he had heard that there were beastly bad rumors again about Beaufort. End of the section, page 194.